I want you to think of a monster. What makes it a monster? Our Monsters reading invited us to ask this question and to think further about how our conception of monsters reflects society. The reading focused on how we defined them in order to understand and define ourselves. It concluded that monsters are a reflection of society, our fears and taboos. This is an incomplete picture, however. We can't have monsters without also having heroes. After all, villains usually exist to oppose heroes. Our conception of heroes tells us just as much, if not more, about ourselves than monsters. If monsters tell us our fears, heroes reveal our hopes and aspirations. So how do we define heroes? This proves to be just as difficult as defining monsters. Explaining what makes a hero heroic is not as straightforward as you may think. In fiction, heroes may have powers which set them apart. However, this doesn't apply to people we'd commonly think of as heroes in the real world, such as first responders or family members. Also, supervillains usually have powers as well, but use them for the wrong reasons. As author Michael Grant said, superpowers don't always make you a superhero. So it seems powers and abilities can play a part in our definition of heroes, but how an individual uses their abilities is more revealing than the ability itself. So what actions differentiate heroes and villains? As I mentioned earlier, on their most basic level, monsters exist to oppose a hero. This is the purpose that defines them, but is the reverse true? Actor David Leon seems to think so, saying the measure of a superhero is always his nemesis. However, this definition of heroes, that they only exist to oppose villains, isn't true in all circumstances. There are plenty of stories where the hero's opposition is nature, or even himself. It's true heroes often oppose monsters, but they don't always. They often stand against our fears, and this is part of our definition, but it can't be the whole picture. Batgirl put it best, saying, "Everything doesn't have to be about fear. There's a room in our line of work for hope too." So let's explore this hope angle. Superheroes don't just stand against something, they also have to stand for something. According to Superman, one of the most iconic superheroes, a hero is an ordinary individual who finds the strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming obstacles. This may be a bit ironic coming from the Man of Steel himself, the epitome of a superhero, but this is probably the best definition we've come across in our discussion today. So let's go back to the start of our discussion. What makes a monster? What makes a hero? It all seems easy now. Heroes are inspirational individuals who stand for honorable values and against villains and monsters who oppose these values. They often have abilities, supernatural or otherwise, that they use in pursuit of this goal. Now throw all this out the window because the definition is still fundamentally flawed. In fact, we shouldn't even be trying to define heroes and monsters in the first place. Heroes stand for honorable values, but what happens when what is honorable or right isn't so black and white? This line of thinking only leads us down a definition rabbit hole as the foundation of each of our definitions is broken down further and further. This conundrum creates some of our most interesting fictional conflicts. Take the Marvel movie Captain America: Civil War, for example. In this movie, two iconic superheroes, Captain America and Iron Man, are fighting each other over a controversial law, the Sokovia Accords, which would hold superheroes accountable for their actions by forcing them to give up their secret identities. Iron Man supports the law in favor of protecting civilians, while Captain America opposes it in favor of protecting heroes. Who's the villain in this conflict? It's hard to define one, isn't it? Okay, so we've already mentioned that stories don't always require anthropomorphic villains. Maybe the villain is more abstract. Perhaps the Sokovia Accords themselves are the villain. Well, we can definitely identify a hero, right? Many heroes, actually. There's Captain America and Iron Man and a whole cast of other heroes in this movie. Except they're fighting against each other. And they stand for different values. And based on our working definition of heroes, which defines heroes by their values, doesn't that mean we have to pick a right side and a wrong side? Except this means we're either calling Captain America or Iron Man, two of the most famous superheroes in existence, villains. This can't be right. Except strangely, that's exactly what fans did. When presented with this dichotomy, fans picked a side, either Team Cap or Team Iron Man. Divisive arguments actually broke out. It was such an issue that the movie actually presented a third option for a villain, Baron Zemo, in the last few minutes of the film to give fans an easier target and diffuse the tension. Alright, so even Marvel dodged the problem of defining villains and heroes. But it's just a movie, and one that was released a while ago. So why do we care? The problem is that this conundrum isn't over. Much like we discussed earlier, monsters, and heroes by extension, affect and reflect society. Perhaps Civil War was slightly prophetic, because we're seeing this pattern of picking sides play out in the real world as well. As seen by the Civil War example, people can't handle the blurred line between good and evil. Too often, people try to force things into one of these categories, right or wrong, hero or villain. This trend is all too prevalent as society becomes increasingly polarized. For example, all I have to say is the name Trump for strong feelings to arise in people's minds. Donald Trump, as many of you know, I'm sure, is a divisive public figure whose stint as U.S. president was characterized by constant conflict. His actions were often described as either all good or all bad with no middle ground. Listening to a family member talk about him the other day, all I could think of was, this is a superhero narrative. Values? Make America great again. Check. Villains? Of course, the opposing political party. Check. But this narrative, and it's just that, a narrative, told by my family member, ignores any nuance. Similarly, the monstrous narrative most newspapers ran while he was a president is similarly black and white, with no room for middle ground. Even though his presidency is over, this polarized political climate has continued, with little sign of reconciliation anytime soon. This pattern is destructive, as the movie Civil War again shows. The conflict in Civil War led to the downfall of Captain America and Iron Man's team, the Avengers. And if the same pattern continues in the real world, it will cause a similar downfall in our own society. In the end, perhaps the best way to identify superheroes is in how they educate and inspire us. We should learn from their strengths and their mistakes. Conflict springs from trying to define absolute good and absolute evil. Marvel likely made the right move, leaving the delineation up to the audience. However, the best solution would be not defining it at all. The most mature conclusion would be that both Captain America and Iron Man were partially right and partially wrong. That asking who the villain was and who the hero was is the wrong question. Instead, we should accept that most people in fiction and the real world embody elements of both.